Happy to do it because you're going to make it look good. You are going to pull out all of the weirdness. Here's a stack of textbooks. This is part and parcel to what we understand to be education. When you think of education, you think of basic components that come into the scene. You have teachers, you have students, and you have texts. What's the relationship between teachers and students and texts? Well, we see an interesting relationship emerged at the Vivarium Monastery in the south of Italy in the 6th century AD. The whole purpose of education, the reason why teachers gather students around them, was to produce texts so they could copy texts. Back in that day, if a text was to exist at all, it had to be hand copied, and it was copied onto perishable materials, and so if those texts were going to survive, they needed to be recopied and recopied. If a student was to encounter a text, the student had to go to one of these monasteries, and they would encounter the text by having the text read to them. You see, at any given school, there would only be one copy of a given text, one handwritten copy. And so the teacher would read the text to the students and explain the meaning of the text. The teacher kind of became an intermediary between the text and the student. And the best teachers, of course, were the charismatic teachers who would take on a life of their own, and the students would see the text kind of through the manner and the virtues of the teacher. Now, this arrangement between teachers, students, and texts began to change in the 12th century. And to find the source of that change, we need to go to Paris, where Peter Abelard was a student of William Champeau. And Peter Abelard wasn't satisfied with the charisma of his teacher. He started asking some hard questions of his teacher, to dispute with his teacher, to challenge his teacher. An acrimonious relationship developed between William and Peter Abelard, between teacher and student. And in this acrimonious environment, appeal was made to the texts rather than to the charisma of the teachers. And so the texts sort of reasserted themselves as a central place, displacing the centrality of the teacher in an education. The arrangement between teacher, student, and text changed yet again in the 16th century. This time we see the advent of movable type and mechanical printing, and for the first time, educators began to realize that students could actually have their own individual copies, and it transformed the whole landscape of education, quite literally. Through mechanical print, books could disseminate into the countryside, and schools could crop up no longer in city centers where the copyists were, but they could crop up anywhere. And education could now proliferate to classes of people that previously had no access to texts, had no access to learning, had no prospects for literacy. So we see that in the 16th century, again, another reconfiguration of the relationship between teachers, students, and texts. These are some of the themes that we explore here at New St. Andrews in a class that we're going to be offering this fall, The History of Classical and Christian Education. We're going to go back to the sources themselves, including some of these great texts, and we're going to find out how teachers, students, and texts reconfigured their relationships at different phases through the story of the Western liberal arts tradition.